Okay, so there's a lot of people I've noticed floating around on social media that have come across some issues with dovetail jigs and things like that. So if you've ever had problems with dovetail jigs, hopefully this video will let you get your head around a lot of it and hopefully turn out some pucker dovetails. This is one of the dovetail jigs that I use. Essentially all dovetail jigs work on the same single principle, and that is the relationship between the cutter and some kind of guide bush with the template that's been used on the jig. Now, some jigs use a bearing guided cutter, some jigs use a guide bush. This particular one uses a guide bush. I'm aware of one from Rockler, Harbour Freight, Lee, Trend. There's a lot out there that work on a very similar, well, the same principle, but a similar kind of setup. This is going to be for blind dovetails. So let's take a look at the jig and how I set it up from start to finish, getting it out of the box to being able to start cutting, basically. Okay, so here's the jig, and the first thing I'm going to do is fix this jig to this board. That will enable me to be able to take the whole lot from one place to another and just clamp it onto a bench without it jiggling around. There. If I put these bits in here, and then I can push it up against this board. Last thing I want to do is fix it too far back, and then it's going to get in the way. So roughly centered-ish on there, and then I'm just going to bring it forward just a hair so that I know that every time I put a piece of timber in here, it's going to clear this bit of board. And also when I put my board and the jig on a bench or on a table or something like that, as long as this isn't set back from the edge of the table, that's never going to get in the way either. Huzzah. The other reason I like a nice large-ish piece of timber is I can write notes on it specifically for the jig. A lot of the comments I've come across are, I use it so infrequently I can never remember all the settings, I've got to find the manual and get them all out, blah blah blah. You can write the notes on here with a pencil and they're ready for next time. So the first thing I'm going to do, and this is really important, if your jig came with a guide bush, then I always mark on the back of the guide bush that it's for the dovetail jig, so don't get it confused with anything else. And I also write with the jig what size guide bush it is in case I need to replace it because I have lost it. So first of all, and in this case it's a 15.8 millimeter, and then the cutter L120 by a quarter TC. Ace. Okay, so I've got 4 bits of timber here, which are the 4 sides of the box slash drawer slash thing you're going to dovetail together to one side. Cut those to length already, so we'll put those to one side for now, and then I'm going to use the offcuts of those boxes to use to set up the jig, because I'm assuming that this is not set up straight out of the box, something like that. So on the front of the jig and on the top of the jig, I've got these pins. So we need to make sure that the spaces we're using are correct. Now some jigs will have little slidey things, and that will tell you in the instructions where to set those up. But for this jig, they're just set pins, and they line up in a specific location for the combs that we're doing, and the comb is specific to the size of joint that we're doing. So for this comb, we're cutting 1/2 inch lapped dovetails. If I were to swap it for this one, this is for 1/2 inch box joints or finger joints or comb joints or whatever you want to call them. And these pins, as I say, will align the piece of work up specifically against this template and ensure that the actual tails and pins are set in the right spacing from where we're referencing from, and normally that would be the top surface, the one that you look at. If I just slide this in here so you can see where it's going to fit. and then I'll slide that in there up against the stop. And there, so see how they are offset to the joints. What we end up doing is we cut the tails and the pins at the same time. So obviously, because the router's going to cut straight through, we need to put the bit that's left in the bit we've cut on the other piece, so that's why they're offset. Now there's two adjustments on here. The first one will adjust how tightly or loosely the tails and pins fit together, and that adjustment is on the router because that's to do with the height of the cutter. The other adjustment is how far in the pins will fit into the tails, or the tails will fit around the pins, and that adjustment is set up on the jig, and it's irrelevant of the thickness of the material because the reference point is actually on this internal bit. It measures from this face in on the pin board, not on the tail board. Yeah, so if this is a thin piece of material or a thick piece of material, what we're going to do is cut the waste off to leave ourselves that distance, and that's set by the manufacturer on your jig. Now on this machine it is, if memory serves, I will check the instructions, it is 15 millimeters, and that comes from the instructions, and I've just downloaded the instructions on there. So I'm going to mark that on here. Okay, so what's the setting line? Right, so the setting line is the distance between the back edge of this tailboard, or the front edge of the pin board, whichever way around you look at it, to the furthest distance on the comb. Yeah, so that needs to be 15 millimeters. Yeah, now if that is too far in, what will happen is the router will route all this waste material. The less material on here means that our tails are going to be longer, and our pin sockets, or the sockets for the tails to fit in between the pins, will be too shallow. So by moving this further this way, we cut less of this material, this becomes longer, this becomes shorter, so that the side, or the tailboard, will protrude out from where it wants to be. Equally, if we have this too far back, we'll cut more of this material, our tails will be shorter, our pin sockets will be deeper, and the board will go further in. So we want to set this forward or back so that it's 15 mil from there. And the way we do that with a marking knife, because I want this to be really accurate, 15 mil line, I hope you can see that. Yeah, so there's 15 mil line on there. Right here I've got a locking nut, yeah, and that will give us the distance, because our comb board will push against that nut, be tightened down by the wing nut, and hopefully give us a 15 mil gap from there to there. Push that down on there, and hopefully I can see that it's actually in a little bit deeper. Because we've got two, if I push one in and one out, I'm going to skew the board. That means our joint's going to be on the skew. So I want to make sure that that's the same all the way along. I think it's actually fairly even across there by the looks of it. So we'll go with that. Put my tailboard in, and I'm just going to plonk it in so that it's up. And then I'm going to place my pin board in the top and make sure that it is nicely snug up against my stop, and also square on the end of this board, and I'm going to clamp that down. Then I'm going to loosen this off and double check that this, because I can get that in at an angle, again, up against the stop, and square and flat across there, and I'm going to tighten that down. Now I can put my comb board template back on there, do the wing nuts up, and that's secure. Okay, that's the jig setup. Now what I want to do is set the router up. So when you're setting your router up, the most important thing I think you need is a fine height adjuster. Like I said, because the fit of the tails and the pins is governed by the height of the cutter, and don't forget we're cutting both pieces at the same time, so it's actually any error is doubled. We need to be able to minutely adjust the depth of cut. That's going to be the most important thing if you want them to fit accurately. If you're trying to plunge it and lock it and use the stock bar for doing dovetails, then you're going to be there forever just setting them up. It makes it far easier to get the everything all set up correctly. The next thing you want to do is put your guide bush on. But if you've got the sort of machine where you can remove the base from the motor, or you've got a cone or some kind of line-up pin, then make sure you always line up the guide bush to the collet and the cutter. That's really, really important. So I'll fit that on. So nice and tight on that. It's not going out. The next thing we're going to do is install the cutter. Okay. Right, now I'm going to adjust the depth. Again, you can use the square. I prefer to use a digital marking gauge, but that's just me. The other option you can use is, like we did with the tailboard, or the pinboard, sorry, marking a line. We can get that lined up to a set distance on our against some kind of reference. Now for this jig and this setup, again I'm going to double check, but the depth of the cutter should be 17 mil. So I'm also going to write that on the baseboard. 16 3/4, 8, 85, 90, 95, 17 mil. And then I'm going to lock that in position so it's not going to go anywhere. At this point, notice I'm using scrap wood, not the material that I want to make my box out of. Yeah. All I'm doing at the moment is confirming that the setup that I've done on the machine, positioning of the combs and the up and down positioning of the cutter, are what the manual said, but I'm half expecting there to be a little discrepancy. And this is where a lot of people make the misconception, just by doing that and getting it right, that this is going to magically turn out to be the perfect fit. I'm expecting there to be a little bit of tinkering to do, but we'll worry about that when we've cut the first ones. Because all I'm going to do is check that they fit. If they don't, cut the ends off, do my adjustments, and move from there. So let's make the first cut. Right, so now's a good time to mention my video on direction of cut with a router. Anti-clockwise around the outside of something, left to right on a template, which would be starting here and moving that towards you, the camera. With the cutter rotating clockwise, that's going to have the tendency to make the grain of the wood want to break out. We don't want to see that on the inside of the box. This is actually going to be inside, so when these two go together, they'll flip over like that, as you'll see in a second. We want to see a nice, crisp, clean line. So what I'm going to do is do a back cut or a climb cut, starting on this edge, just to basically score the shoulder line of the joint across there somewhere. So that's given me a nice clean line on the inside of the joint. Now I can start at this end and machine my tails and my pins. Now we can take these out and see if they fit. Now, hopefully you can see, if I put that in there, so it's only going in half a tail. I put that right on, see how that's now sticking proud? That's telling me that this finger is too far forward, because when I'm routing these, I'm not routing in far enough, and I'm routing not far enough on the pins. So that's protruding about 2 mil. What I've got to do now is cut that off and start again. It's a bit tight, so we'll change the colour again. I'm hoping that's a better focus. Right, we've got a slight gap here and here, and actually it's starting to split this pin. But that's perfectly flush there, beautifully flush, and actually nice and flush there as well. I want to drop the cutter a little bit more. So I've got my dovetails in there, and you might not be able to see on the camera. We've got it nice and tight on the inside, nice and flush, and then this pin board is just ever so slightly proud, but I can sand that nice and flush when it's all assembled. So I'm going to cut these off and lay out from the box. The thing I'm going to do is put on here what the adjustments are. Too loose, increase depth of cut. Too tight, decrease depth of cut. Joint is too shallow, tails stick out, move the comb in. Tails too far in, we're going to move comb out. So, right, here's my 4 pieces, 2 sides, front and back. Yep. So I want these to be the tops, so I want the same reference all the way around so I don't get any discrepancies. So this is going to be my top, my top, my top, and my top. So there's the 2 pieces that I was cutting, and I was cutting them that way. Yeah, so you can see when it's cut like that, these are going to flip over and become the insides. Yeah, and that's my tail. So that's the same as that joint there. So I lay these out that way. That's how I want them, and then when they go into the jig, they're going to be these sides facing out. Another way to remember this, I've been told, is this is on the left, so you can put it on the left side of the jig. This is on the right, so when we cut that one, we're going to register it on the right hand side of the jig. But I always remember the top of the box wants to be registered against our datum, and that's those little spaces. So even though I was referencing off the right hand side of the jig as a unit, I still started on the right, did my scribe cut, or my climb cut, my back cut, whatever you want to call it, just to score the grain on the inside. That was a nice fit. That was not a bad fit. A little bit of movement there. That will certainly work. Now on this one, see how I've got these gaps here, 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 and here and here. What happened was the pin board, sorry, that was in the top. The bar wasn't clamped flat. It was tight at one end, and that caused it to be a bit loose at the other, and tightened down the other, which meant it was basically pivoting on the one corner and caused it to skew out. And I didn't notice it until I got to the looser end. So rather than have them completely offset, what I've done is put it back in and rerouted it. Now, anytime you run the router over a second time, even if you don't move the timber in the jig, you'll get a slightly looser fit, which is kind of a technique you can use if you're using really hard woods and they're really tight anyway. You can go a second time and make them a bit looser. But basically, the pin board had skewed in the jig, so it's something you need to watch out for. All I'm going to do is probably just fill that. For the job I've got planned for this, it'll be fine. Now the other thing to mention is these aren't symmetrical, as you can see there. I've got a half pin and then kind of 2/3 of a tail, and that's because of the thickness of the material. Now you can offset the material within the jig to work out where it needs to go to mark it and centralise it on the comb. But I'll be honest, I never do that. I never ever do that. I always just make that the bottom of the box I'm making, unless it's an absolute necessity that it's got to be symmetrical. I honestly never bother. Okay, so I'm going to bring the camera in because I'm guessing that looks pretty good on video from that, and I'm going to show you all the close-up flaws with this one. So I'm going to bring the camera in. Okay, so obviously the first thing is this hole. That's where I cut the groove for the board. Now normally I would cut those between the pins, so then they're hidden by the tail going into the slot. Tiny little gaps there, and that's because of my lineup of the timber in the jig. But you see how it's all consistent all the way around there. That's the other corner. Again, pretty consistent all the way across. Obviously, that's going to happen on all of them, but I'm going to put some little pegs in there to hide those. Again, consistent. There's the hole, the glue's squeezed in there, I'm going to peg that. And then the last one, on here, we've got some pretty nasty gaps. Now you see how these are quite big? That's where I had to put the router back on it, because this piece, the pin piece on the top, moved in the jig. So that's really annoying, but I'm going to try and peg those as well with some little slivers of end grain. Hopefully that'll fill those in. So there we go. There's always going to be this kind of dispute. I can hand cut dovetails quicker than setting it up and blah blah blah. That's fine. It goes back to pretty much everything else in woodworking. There's many ways to do the same thing. I'm rubbish at hand cutting dovetails. I don't really like doing it. I'm too impatient. Kind of the purpose of the point of the video is There's loads of different dovetail jigs out there. They all pretty much work on the same principle, the actual mechanics of it. They're not going to work straight out of the box. They can be a little bit fiddly to set up. 2, 3, 4. But once you understand the mechanics of what's going on with the jig, it makes it much quicker to set it up. And once it's set up, it's absolutely done. Point to note also is that this will now work on any thickness of material. There's a range with these 1/2 inch and also with the smaller 1/4 inch dovetails. There's a recommended range of material, and that is predominantly because if you've got 1/4 inch dovetails set up in inch thick timber, it kind of looks a bit silly. I think it's 12, and I think it's 1/2 inch is the thinnest material for 1/2 inch dovetails, because again they start to look a bit silly. But the reason this jig will now work on 1/2 inch timber, and I could put inch thick timber in it, or 3/4 inch, or anything in between that, and it would work in the same way. And the reason for that is the way it's positioned in the jig. It's cutting the distance at the back of the material, because we're always cutting from the inside of the joint. If this board is thicker, it makes no difference, because all we're going to do is round off that front edge of the stock. So yeah, don't think you have to keep resetting it just because you change the thickness of your material. As long as you're within the parameters of that material for that size of dovetail, that's fine. The router stays the same, the jig stays the same, you just put a different thickness material, clamp it in, and away you go. I'll repair those bits, put some finish on it, and this will just end up as some kind of shop box, I don't know, for something. This was just made out of some bits I had left over from something else, but I'll put it to good use. Hopefully that clears up a few myths. Hopefully it makes you think, oh, actually, yeah, I can set up my dovetail jig and get it with it, and it won't sit there dusty in a corner, and you won't go, oh, I'll sell it to somebody else. Use the colour specific to that jig. Use the guide bush or bearing, if you're a bearing guided colour, specific to that jig. Kind of get an understanding of the mechanics of it, how it's working, makes it so much easier and much quicker setting it up. Once it's set up, job done. But there, let me know what you think in the comments. Argue your point, I could do it quicker, or I'm never going to pick up a dovetail jig because, for whatever reason, I'd be really interested to know your thoughts on the subject as well. So feel free to get in touch. I am also tempted to do similar video, but for the box joints, because I actually prefer box joints, and I think they're becoming more and more fashionable. Dovetails for drawers, but box joints for boxes. So don't forget to like and subscribe. See you back here next time. And if you've got any ideas or questions about anything I've covered, any of my other videos, or something you'd like to see me do, get in touch. We'll see you soon.